Jews have a special connection to American society, but explaining what that connection is can sometimes be a little bit tricky. You could talk about American Jewish literature, or you could talk about American Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, or assimilation trends, or you could talk about general success in the arts and the sciences and in politics. But there's one doorway into American Judaism that I am particularly partial to, and that's food. Let's talk about what American Jews eat. Go into any supermarket today and look at the packaging of your average product. What do you see? You're likely going to find a barrage of labels and symbols. USDA, vegan, non-GMO, whatever. But then there's this one. It's a U inside of a circle. It's called an OU. An OU means a food is kosher and has been certified by the Orthodox Union, a Jewish communal organization which happens to be the largest certifier of kosher products in the world. In the US, kosher certification is big business. Somewhere between 25 and 40% of foods in a typical supermarket have some form of kosher certification, and more foods are certified as kosher than organic or premium. And kosher certification paved the way for all the other kinds of certification that you see on American foods. Kosher certification may seem like an obvious thing to do, but it actually wasn't always this way. In fact, it's really a deeply American idea, one developed long before the FDA made food safety standards, and one that flourished here in a way that it hasn't in basically any other country. So why did thousands of American companies voluntarily put a private Jewish company's stamp of approval on their packaging? It turns out the answer can tell us a lot about how Jews became and remain American consumers. First, let's talk about what makes something kosher or not in the first place. It's actually a lot of things. There are foods that are just off limits entirely, like pork and shellfish, which you're not supposed to eat at all. Then, there are foods like chicken and milk, which are fine to eat on their own, but prohibited if you cook them together. There's also a few special foods, like meat and wine, which require a Jewish person to be involved at some point in the preparation process itself. Now, figuring out whether a food is kosher isn't always so difficult. Unprocessed foods, like fruits and grains, are almost always fine. And if the food you buy is prepared locally, then trusting that the food is kosher basically just comes down to trusting your local kosher butcher or baker or whoever. But when supply chains get longer, things get a lot more complicated. Let's take, for example, cheese. Just looking at the final product doesn't give you the full picture as to whether it's kosher, because something problematic could have happened in the production process and you just never know. Back in the day, cheese also traveled better than other foods, so a person who wanted to eat it might just have no idea who the cheesemaker was or whether they could be trusted. Because of these complications, some of the earliest kosher certifications we have are for cheese. This one, from the Cairo Geniza in Egypt, is 800 years old, and if you look carefully, you can see the word kosher right over here. In the 20th century, the complications of the cheese process basically become the default. And because of that, keeping kosher gets a lot more difficult. Grocery stores, as well as the new supermarkets, line their shelves with processed foods made in giant factories. And for Jewish consumers, those were basically black boxes. To combat this, Orthodox Jews, and particularly Orthodox Jewish women, began campaigning for better information. They wanted to know, for example, whether it was okay to buy a cake mix, or a can of beans, or a sleeve of crackers. And they pressed their communal organizations to figure out ways to solve this problem. In other words, to let them be mainstream American consumers. And the solution they chose was a pretty radical one. In 1924, the Orthodox Union hatched a plan. They would send people into factories all around the country to inspect facilities where food was made and prepared. Then, they would report back to their communities to determine which products could be eaten. The goal wasn't simply to create a big list of foods that were kosher that Jews could reference every time they went to the grocery store. Instead, the OU envisioned a world where observant Jews could do what everyone else did: to go into a store, to inspect whatever products were there, and decide on the spot what to buy without having to consult external sources of information. It was a bold vision. In order for it to work, the OU needed buy-in from major brands. The first big company to take up the idea was Heinz, which was known at the time more for its pickles than for its ketchup. Heinz was willing to put a mark on their packaging, knowing this would sway a large market of Jewish consumers towards their brand and away from competitors. But at the same time, they felt marking their products with a Jewish symbol, like say a Hebrew letter, would alienate their non-Jewish customers. To solve for this, Heinz, with the help of a promotional agency, designed a new symbol, the letter U, inside a circle. This would serve as a simple, clear indicator that a food was kosher, while at once being invisible for consumers not in the know. And the strategy worked. A few years later, 26 of Heinz's 57 varieties wore the symbol. In the decade that followed, many other companies adopted kosher labeling too. Certification, it turns out, was a win-win for consumers and manufacturers. Kosher-keeping Jews got access to new products, and kosher makers got access to a new customer base. Today, there are hundreds of kosher certifiers. And because so many products are certified, companies that want to get certification often find that all of the hard work has been done for them because their suppliers are already labeled as kosher. This powerful network effect says a lot about the massive success of private kosher certification. I find this story fascinating because none of it was inevitable. The OU could have certified foods made by major American food producers, but just kept the information in a public list. And Jewish consumers could have used that list to inform their shopping, which is how things are still done in Europe. Jewish consumers also could have just turned to companies owned by conscientious Jews, like Manischewitz. But American Jewish consumers just weren't interested in any of these options. They wanted to judge what to buy at the supermarket just by looking at the label, just like everybody else. They wanted their traditions to be compatible with mainstream American culture and not force them out of it. American Jews often question just how visible their religious identity should be, about whether they should push for Hanukkah menorahs next to Christmas trees, or how liberalism and Zionism should interact, or how to think about anti-Semitism in America. But American identity in particular is shaped by the products that people buy. In the 90s, when Nabisco swapped the lard in its Oreo cookies for vegetable shortening so that they could make their cookies kosher, Rabbi Joshua Hammerman wrote in the New York Times, only half jokingly, that it was a sign that Jews have finally made it. The story of the kosher symbol, then, is really a kind of microcosm for American Judaism overall. To be an American, to buy as an American, but to nonetheless remain distinctly Jewish.
If you like this video, subscribe to the channel. Also, we have all sorts of content that's not in video form, including podcasts, lectures, possibly events in your area. So if you want to keep up with what the Shalom Hartman Institute is doing, go to shalomhartman.org and sign up for our newsletter.